Tom had worked for almost 30 years as an engineer before he finally decided it was time to slow down. He had always dreamed of spending his retirement somewhere peaceful, far from the noise of the city. He didn't want anything fancy, just a quiet place with water nearby where he could fish, read, and enjoy the sound of the wind moving through the trees. After months of searching, he found a small but beautiful house by a lake. The moment he stood on the back porch and saw the calm water stretching out before him, he knew this was where he wanted to live the rest of his life. The lake shimmered in the afternoon sun, and birds glided low across its surface. It felt like a dream come true. The neighborhood was run by a homeowners association, the kind that promised to keep the community beautiful and organized. Tom didn't think much of it at first. The people seemed friendly enough when he moved in. He liked the clean sidewalks, the trimmed lawns, and the quiet evenings. Everything seemed perfect. Tom had one simple joy in life: boats. He had grown up near the coast, where he spent weekends helping his father fix old fishing boats. He wasn't a fan of big or loud ones. He preferred small, quiet boats that could glide over the water without disturbing the peace. So a few months after moving in, he bought himself a small vintage boat. It wasn't new or flashy, but it was clean, well kept, and perfectly fit for the calm lake outside his home. That first morning he took it out was unforgettable. The sun had just risen, painting the lake gold. The water was so still it looked like glass. He felt completely at peace as he paddled across the surface. It was the kind of quiet happiness that's hard to describe, simple, deep, and real. But the peace didn't last long. A week later, Tom found a white envelope in his mailbox. The envelope had the HOA logo printed in bold blue letters. He opened it thinking it was some kind of welcome note. Instead, it was a notice of violation. The letter claimed his boat did not meet community visual standards. Tom frowned as he read the words again. Community visual standards? What did that even mean? His boat was clean, painted white, and tied neatly to the small dock behind his house. He didn't see a single problem with it. He decided it must be a mistake. Maybe someone on the HOA board hadn't seen the boat properly or mixed up house numbers. Tom wrote a polite reply explaining that his boat was in good condition and didn't break any rule he could find in the HOA handbook. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This time it said that boats with motors of any kind were not allowed on the lake. Tom blinked in disbelief. His small boat didn't even have a gas motor. It ran on a quiet, rechargeable electric motor that barely made a sound. He thought the rule was meant for noisy speedboats, not small electric ones. He walked to the community office to talk to someone face to face. The woman at the desk was polite but nervous. She said he should attend the next HOA meeting if he wanted to discuss the matter. When the meeting day came, Tom showed up early. The room was filled with about 20 people, mostly neighbors he recognized from walks around the lake. At the front sat the HOA board members. The president, Linda, sat in the middle, wearing a bright red jacket and a look that said she liked being in charge. When it was Tom's turn to speak, he stood and calmly explained that his boat was electric and didn't disturb anyone. He had even checked the HOA rule book. There was no clear mention of electric boats being banned. Linda looked down at her papers and then back up at him. Her voice was sharp. "The rule clearly says no motorized boats," she said. "Electric or not, it still uses a motor." Tom tried to reason with her. "I understand, but the rule doesn't specify what kind of motor. My boat doesn't make noise or pollute the water. It's safe and quiet." "Surely that's different." Linda shook her head. "Rules are rules," she said flatly. The room went quiet. A few neighbors looked uncomfortable but didn't speak. Tom sighed and sat down. He had a feeling this wasn't just about the boat. Something about Linda's tone told him she liked having control. The next week, another letter came. This one a fine for improper use of community property. Tom couldn't believe it. It felt unfair and personal. He decided to take photos of his boat, the dock and the lake, and sent them with a detailed explanation to the HOA office. But the response was the same: remove the boat or face more penalties. Slowly, the peaceful mornings Tom had loved turned into stressful ones. He would look at his boat and feel anger bubbling inside him. He wasn't hurting anyone, yet he was being treated like a rule breaker. He tried talking to a few neighbors about it. Some of them quietly admitted they thought the rule was ridiculous, but they didn't want to get involved. "I got fined once for having my garbage can out too long," one neighbor whispered. "If you argue with them, they just find more ways to make your life miserable." That night, Tom sat by his window looking at the reflection of the moon on the water. The lake was calm, beautiful, and peaceful, everything he had dreamed of. But he couldn't even enjoy it anymore because of the endless letters and threats. He thought about selling the boat, but something in him refused to give up. He had worked too hard for this peace. He wasn't breaking any real law. He was simply being bullied by people who liked power. As he sat there, he made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't be pushed around. He had followed every rule, kept his home tidy, respected everyone around him, and yet he was being punished for enjoying something simple. He didn't know how yet, but he decided one thing for sure. He was going to stand up for himself. That night, Tom went to bed with a different kind of peace, not the kind that comes from still water or morning light, but the kind that comes from quiet determination. Something inside him had changed. He didn't know that his small act of defiance would soon turn into a story that no one in that community would ever forget. After that last meeting, Tom hoped the issue would die down. Maybe they would leave him alone once they saw he wasn't trying to cause trouble. But the opposite happened. The following week, he received another envelope from the HOA. The words on the paper were colder this time. It said that since he hadn't removed his boat, the fines would increase each week until he complied. They even added a warning that legal action could follow if he continued to ignore community guidelines. Tom sat at his kitchen table, holding the letter for a long moment. He could feel his heartbeat rise as he read it again. It didn't feel like a neighborhood community anymore, it felt like a trap. He walked outside to look at his boat, still tied neatly to the dock. The morning sun reflected off the smooth surface of the lake. Everything looked peaceful, but Tom's mind was restless. He didn't understand how something so harmless could make people so angry. A few days later, he went to the next HOA meeting, hoping to clear things up. When he arrived, the room was already full. Linda sat in her usual spot at the front, surrounded by the other board members. She had that same stiff smile that didn't reach her eyes. As Tom walked in, a few people nodded politely, but most avoided eye contact. Everyone knew who he was now, the boatman, as some called him quietly. When the time came for open discussion, Tom stood up. His voice was calm but firm. "I'm here again because I still don't understand why my small electric boat is a problem," he said. "I'm not disturbing anyone, and I've read the rules. There's nothing that clearly says this type of boat is not allowed." Linda didn't look up from her papers. "The rule says no motorized boats," she replied, her tone sharp. "It doesn't need to specify what kind. A motor is a motor," Tom sighed. "But this is not a speedboat. It's quiet. It doesn't leak fuel or make noise. It's safer than most paddle boats." Linda finally looked up. "Rules aren't meant to be bent just because you think you're an exception," she said coldly. "If we allow one person to ignore them, everyone else will want to do the same." Tom glanced around the room, hoping someone might speak up for him. But no one did. Most people stared at the floor, pretending to read the agenda papers. A few looked sorry, but not one dared to open their mouth. It became clear that Linda wasn't just enforcing rules. She was enjoying the control. The meeting ended with no solution. Tom walked home with a heavy heart. He had always believed that fairness and reason could solve most problems. But this felt different. This felt personal. The following week, the harassment got worse. First came the letters, 2, sometimes 3 in a week, each one listing a new complaint. They said his grass was too long, even though it wasn't. They said his trash bin was visible from the road, even though it was neatly placed behind his fence. Every little thing became a violation. Tom started to realize the HOA was trying to wear him down. If they couldn't win through the boat issue, they'd find other ways to make his life difficult. He tried to stay calm. He paid the small fines at first, thinking it might stop the nonsense, but the letters kept coming. Then one morning, he found a bright orange notice taped to his front door. It was a formal warning that his continued defiance could lead to court action. That was the moment. Something inside him broke. He wasn't an angry man by nature. He'd always believed in kindness and staying calm and respectful. But now, standing on his porch with that notice in his hand, he felt a mix of anger and disbelief. He had moved here for peace, not to fight endless battles with people who seemed to take plea. Later that day, he saw one of his neighbors, an older man named George, walking by. George stopped and said quietly, "You're not the first, you know. They did this to a woman last year because her flower pots weren't the approved color. She ended up moving out." Tom was shocked. "You're kidding." George shook his head. "They think they own the place. Most of us just try to stay out of their way." He lowered his voice and added, "But you've got more guts than the rest of us. Don't give up." Those words stuck with Tom. He realized that maybe he wasn't just fighting for himself. Maybe this was about standing up to unfairness that everyone else was too afraid to face. Over the next few days, Tom started to pay closer attention. He noticed how the HOA board used fear to keep people silent. They'd fine anyone who questioned their authority. People kept their lawns perfect, their houses spotless, not out of pride, but out of fear of the next letter. It reminded Tom of his old job, where one boss used to bully everyone just because he could. The memory brought back the same tight feeling in his chest, so he decided to take a different approach. Instead of reacting out of frustration, he began to quietly collect information. He reread the HOA rulebook line by line, looking for loopholes and inconsistencies. He made copies of every letter they sent him and took pictures of his property to prove he was following every rule. If they wanted a fight, he'd do it smartly. Then one afternoon, Linda showed up in person. She stood by his driveway with a clipboard in hand and a forced smile. "Mr. Tom," she said in a sweet tone that didn't match her eyes, "we've had several complaints about your property again. Are you sure you don't want to remove that boat and avoid all this trouble?" Tom looked at her calmly. "My boat isn't hurting anyone," he said. "And as far as I can see, I'm following every rule in your handbook." Her smile faded. "We'll see about that," she said, turning away. That night, Tom sat on his porch again, watching the moonlight shimmer on the lake. It used to make him feel calm. Now it made him feel something else, determined. He had spent his whole life solving problems with logic and patience. This was just another challenge, though a strange one. He knew the fight wasn't over. But he also knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going anywhere. And deep down, he had a feeling that the story wasn't just about a boat anymore. Something bigger was about to happen. Something that would change not only his life but the entire neighborhood. Tom tried to live quietly after that last encounter with the HOA president, but the tension never left. Every time he checked his mail, he felt a knot in his stomach. Every time he heard footsteps outside, he wondered if it was another visit from the board. The peaceful life he had dreamed of had turned into a constant waiting game, waiting for the next complaint, the next fine, the next threat. Weeks passed, and he continued to stand his ground. He didn't take his boat off the lake. He didn't argue anymore either. He just stayed silent and calm, even when new letters showed up. But deep inside, something was changing. The frustration that once filled him was slowly being replaced by a quiet curiosity, a question that wouldn't leave his mind. Who actually owned the lake? The HOA acted as if they controlled everything: the docks, the water, even the fish that swam in it. But Tom wasn't so sure. He started to wonder if they truly had the legal right to enforce all these rules. One cloudy afternoon, Tom decided to find out. He went down to the county office in town and asked for public records about the neighborhood. The clerk was an older man who had probably worked there for years. He was kind and helpful, and when Tom explained his situation, the man gave a small, knowing smile. "Those HOA people again, huh?" the clerk said quietly. "You're not the first to ask about that lake." Tom leaned forward. "So, who owns it?" The man flipped through a few files on his computer, then printed out a couple of pages. "Not the HOA," he said, handing them over. "It's owned by a private management company. They've been trying to sell it for a while now, actually. Too expensive to maintain." Tom blinked. "Sell it, the whole lake?" The clerk nodded. "Yep, it's public record. They'd let it go for the right price." Tom walked out of that office holding those papers like they were gold. His heart was pounding. The HOA didn't own the lake. They only managed access to it. All their threats, all their fines, all their bold talk, it was built on the assumption that no one would ever question them. That night, Tom sat at his kitchen table staring at the documents spread in front of him. He could feel a spark of something he hadn't felt in months: excitement. For the first time since moving there, he saw a way to truly take back his peace. The next few days, he made a few calls. He reached out to the company that owned the lake and asked if they were still open to selling it. To his surprise, they were more than ready. The maintenance costs had been draining them, and the liability of managing it wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Tom had savings from his years of hard work. He had never been the type to waste money, and he didn't have a family to support anymore. Just himself and his dream of a quiet life. Buying the lake wouldn't be cheap, but it was possible. And more than that, it was poetic. The same lake the HOA had tried to take from him could become his. Still, he didn't rush. He did his research carefully, consulting a lawyer to understand exactly what ownership would mean. Once he confirmed that the HOA's power would end the moment he became the legal owner, he made his decision. A few weeks later, the sale went through. Tom signed the papers with a calm smile. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like justice. He didn't tell anyone right away. He wanted to make sure everything was official first. When he finally received the deed in the mail, he held it in his hands for a long moment, barely believing it was real. The lake, the same one that had brought him peace, then stress, and now triumph, was officially his. Word spread faster than he expected. The HOA found out within days, and their next meeting was filled with confusion and panic. Tom didn't attend, but he heard from a neighbor that the room had been chaos. People were shouting, papers were flying, and Linda had gone pale when someone announced that Tom was now the legal owner of the lake. The next morning, another letter showed up in his mailbox. It was short and clearly written in anger. It said the HOA would be reviewing the matter and ensuring community policies remain intact. Tom smiled as he read it. Then, instead of replying with words, he attached a copy of his ownership deed and mailed it back to them with a short note. Thank you for your concern. Please direct any future questions about the lake to its owner. That single note changed everything. The following week, Tom saw Linda herself walking around the lake, talking to people in hushed tones. She looked furious, but there was nothing she could do. The legal documents were clear. The lake was his private property now. The HOA had no authority to control it, no power to issue rules about it, no right to fine anyone for using it. For the first time in months, Tom felt free. He took his boat out again, this time with a lightness in his heart he hadn't felt since moving there. The water rippled gently beneath him. The sky reflected perfectly on the surface, and as he drifted across the lake, he smiled to himself. Some neighbors waved from their yards, and a few even came down to the shore to talk. They were curious and excited, asking what would happen now that he owned the lake. Tom just laughed softly. Nothing dramatic, he said. Everyone can still use it, as long as we all respect it. People seemed relieved. They'd been tired of the HOA's strict control, tired of the endless rules. For the first time, there was hope that the neighborhood might actually feel like a community again. That night, Tom sat outside under the stars, listening to the sound of crickets and the gentle splash of water. He thought back to the months of frustration and how close he'd come to giving up. If he had sold his boat or moved away, the HOA would have won. But he hadn't. He had stayed patient, and now, in the quiet night air, that patience had turned into something beautiful. He realized that sometimes standing your ground doesn't mean yelling or fighting. It means staying calm, thinking smart, and waiting for the right moment to act. As he looked out at the lake, his lake now, a soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine. Tom smiled. For the first time in a long while, the world felt peaceful again. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to let go quietly, but no matter what came next, Tom knew he finally had something stronger than their rules. He had control, and most of all, he had his freedom back. The news that Tom had bought the lake spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. At first, many residents didn't believe it. People thought it was just a rumor or some kind of misunderstanding. But when word got around that Tom had the official deed and the county records confirmed it, everyone realized it was true. The man the HOA tried to silence now owned the very thing they had tried to control. For a few days, the whole community buzzed with whispers. Some people laughed quietly when they walked past Tom's house. Others stopped to congratulate him. "You actually bought the lake?" one man asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "You might be the first person to ever outsmart the HOA." Tom just smiled modestly. He wasn't looking for fame or revenge. He had never wanted to make enemies. All he wanted was peace, and now in his own quiet way, he finally But the HOA board wasn't ready to let go of their power so easily. A few days later, Tom received another letter. It looked official, stamped with the HOA logo again. He could almost predict what it said before even opening it. The letter accused him of violating community procedures by taking control of the lake without proper authorization. Tom chuckled softly to himself. Proper authorization, he repeated. The lake had never belonged to them to begin with. They didn't own it, and they didn't even pay to maintain it. Now that it was officially his, they had no legal ground to stand on. Still, he decided to respond. He didn't want to argue or show anger. Instead, he wrote a short note back. Dear Board, as you are aware, the lake is now privately owned. HOA jurisdiction does not apply to it. I appreciate your understanding as I continue maintaining it responsibly for everyone's enjoyment. Sincerely, Tom. He sent it off with a small smile. A week later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Though Tom didn't attend, neighbors filled him in afterward. The president had been furious, pacing back and forth in front of the group, waving papers in the air. She insisted that Tom's ownership was invalid and promised to take legal action. But every lawyer they called gave the same answer. There was nothing they could do. The sale was completely legal. Soon, their control began to crumble. Without the lake under their authority, many of the HOA's rules became meaningless. They could no longer fine residents for using boats, fishing, or organizing small gatherings near the water. For years, the board had used the lake as their main source of power. Now it was gone. Tom, meanwhile, quietly got to work. He hired a few local workers to clean the shoreline, repair the small dock, and set up new benches by the water. Then he put up a simple wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Lake Serenity. Respect the water, respect each other." There were no complicated rules, no strict fines, no loud enforcement. Just a gentle reminder of how things should be. The change was almost instant. Families began coming out in the evenings again. Children who had been told to stay off the lake for years were suddenly free to paddle in small kayaks or fish with their parents. Laughter returned to the neighborhood. The sound of joy replaced the silence that fear had once created. Neighbors started greeting each other again. They shared food by the lake, held small picnics, and even organized a weekend cleanup event to keep it beautiful. Tom didn't have to tell anyone what to do. People naturally took care of what they now felt part of. One evening, as Tom sat on his porch watching a few kids skip stones across the water, an older woman from down the street came by with a pie. She smiled shyly and said, "Thank you for what you did. We all wanted to stand up to them, but we never had the courage." Tom smiled back. "It wasn't courage," he said softly. "I just got tired of being pushed around," but inside he knew it was more than that. He had learned that sometimes standing up doesn't mean shouting or fighting. It means taking back control in your own way. With patience and quiet strength, the HOA, realizing they were losing their grip, tried one last time to intimidate him. They sent a final letter claiming that Tom's use of the lake disturbed the community harmony. This time, Tom didn't even reply. He simply forwarded the letter to his lawyer, who responded formally and firmly that the HOA no longer had any legal say in the matter. That was the end of it. Not long after, several members of the HOA board resigned. People had grown tired of their constant threats and unfair fines. New volunteers stepped up. People who actually wanted to make the neighborhood better, not control it. Under new leadership, the community changed completely. The new board began working with residents instead of against them. They stopped unnecessary fines and focused on real issues, like safety, repairs, and helping elderly neighbors with maintenance. As for Linda, she slowly disappeared from the picture. Some said she moved away. Others said she just stopped attending meetings. Tom never asked. He didn't hold any grudges. He figured everyone eventually learns what happens when power becomes more important than kindness. Months later, on a calm summer evening, the lake glowed under the setting sun. The water rippled softly as families laughed nearby. Tom sat quietly in his boat, the same one that had started all this trouble, drifting near the center of the lake. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. The sound of water brushing against the side of the boat, children laughing, birds calling in the distance. It was the sound of peace, the very thing he had moved there for. A neighbor paddled by in a small canoe and waved. "Never thought I'd see this day," the man said with a grin. You turned this whole place around." Tom smiled and replied, "I didn't do it alone. Everyone just needed a chance to breathe." The man nodded. "Still, you gave them that chance." As the sun dipped below the trees, painting the lake orange and gold, Tom felt an incredible sense of contentment. What began as a fight over a simple boat had turned into something much bigger, a lesson about standing up for yourself and doing what's right, even when you're outnumbered. He didn't seek revenge or fame. He only wanted fairness, and in the end, that's exactly what he got. That night, as the stars reflected on the calm surface of Lake Serenity, Tom finally felt what he had wanted from the start: a life of peace surrounded by good people, free from the noise of power and pride. And for everyone in that neighborhood, the story of the man who bought the lake became more than just gossip. It became a reminder that one person's quiet courage could change everything. The morning air was still and calm, with a thin layer of mist resting over the new lake. The sun peeked through the trees, glinting off the smooth water surface like gold. The quiet hum of a small motor broke the silence as the man slowly guided his boat away from the dock he had built himself. It was early, and he liked it that way. Early mornings were peaceful. No noise, no arguments, no HOA letters stuffed in his mailbox. Just him and the water. He leaned back in his seat, smiling to himself. What had started as frustration had turned into something he could only describe as freedom. A few months ago, he couldn't even park his boat near his home without someone complaining. Now that same boat floated in the middle of a lake he owned. He didn't just beat the HOA, he outsmarted them in the most unexpected way possible. He had worked hard for this. The new lake wasn't just a hole filled with water, it was a complete ecosystem. He had fish swimming under the surface, birds nesting around the edges, and even a small wooden cabin he used for guests. It had become more than a project. It was a sanctuary, but he wasn't the only one enjoying it. His neighbors, the ones who had stood by him when the HOA made his life miserable, now spent weekends on the lake too. Families brought their kids to fish, some paddled in kayaks, and others simply sat by the shore to relax. It had become a community space, free from the endless restrictions of homeowners' rules. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The HOA had wanted to control everything: how tall the grass could be, what color the doors should look like, and even what kind of boat could be parked nearby. Yet here he was, owning something bigger than any of them had ever imagined. News of his lake spread faster than he expected. People from nearby towns came to visit, curious to see the man who had bought land and created his own private retreat after clashing with an HOA. Some came to admire it, others to learn from him, and a few just to gossip. But he didn't mind. He'd learned to take all kinds of attention in stride. One afternoon, as he sat near the water with a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the HOA president, the same man who once called his boat an eyesore. The message was oddly polite, asking if they could meet to discuss community cooperation. He chuckled quietly. A week later, they met near the old neighborhood boundary. The president, looking slightly uncomfortable, started talking about how the HOA wanted to move past old misunderstandings. He explained that property values had gone up because of the nearby lake, and the association was even interested in building a stronger relationship. The man listened quietly, nodding, hiding his amusement. When the president finally paused, he simply said, "I'm glad the lake helped your values. That was never my goal, but I'm happy to hear it." Then he added, "But I like keeping things simple out here. No rules, no committees, just peace." The president smiled awkwardly, realizing there was no deal to be made. The man wasn't angry anymore. He was simply done. After the meeting, he returned to his lake and thought about how far things had come. A few years ago, the HOA had seemed unbeatable. They had power, influence, and the ability to make people's lives difficult. But he had learned something powerful. When you take control of your own space, no one can dictate how you live. The seasons changed, and the lake became more beautiful with each passing month. In the fall, golden leaves floated across the surface. In winter, a thin layer of ice shimmered like glass. Spring brought new life, flowers blooming near the banks and ducks nesting in the reeds. The lake had its own rhythm now, one that didn't depend on anyone's approval. He often thought about how one letter had started it all. A simple complaint about a boat had turned into a challenge that reshaped his life. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about building something meaningful out of frustration. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, he sat with his closest friend on the dock. They shared a quiet laugh, remembering the early days of arguments and meetings. His friend asked, "Do you ever miss living there? You know, in the old neighborhood?" He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "No. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The lake reflected the fading orange light as if agreeing with him. The calmness around them said everything words couldn't. In time, the lake became more than just his victory. It became a symbol for everyone tired of being pushed around by those who think they can control everything. Local magazines even wrote articles about him, calling him the man who bought freedom. He never liked that title much, but he understood what they meant. Sometimes, young couples who were building new homes would visit and ask him how he did it. He'd smile and say, "It wasn't about the money or the land. It was about standing up for what matters to you." Years passed, and the HOA that once gave him trouble began to fade into the background. New members joined, old ones retired, and eventually their strictness softened. Perhaps they learned something from him, or maybe they just got tired of fighting over every small thing. Either way, peace returned to the area. He, however, stayed by his lake. The water still sparkled in the morning light, and the same old boat still floated proudly near the dock. Every time he saw it, he was reminded of how one stubborn decision had changed everything. He didn't need anyone's approval anymore. He had his own lake, his own rules, and most importantly, his own peace. And while the HOA once tried to tell him what he could or couldn't do, now they drove past his land with quiet respect. Some even stopped to take pictures of the lake that had once been a symbol of defiance, but now stood for independence and calm. The man had built more than a lake. He had built a story that people would tell for years. A story about standing firm when others tried to push you down. A story about turning frustration into freedom. And as he sat by the water one last time that evening, listening to the soft ripple of waves and the distant call of a bird, he smiled. The fight had been worth it. Sometimes the best way to win is not to argue, but to build your own lake and let the world come to you.